What was the role of Captain Edmund Saunders in the Bristol slave trade? In getting to our line of inquiry on our field trip to Bristol, we embarked upon a guided walking tour where we were taken to spots in the city that had historical significance within Bristol's involvement in the slave trade. The tour gave us a brief history of the locations and allowed us to explore Bristol's associations with slavery as we moved through the built environment. We found particularly interesting Guinea Street after discovering the meaning behind its name. Guinea Street was named after the well-known Guinea golden coin, which itself was derived from a country on the West African Gold Coast. The houses on the street during the Georgian period were occupied by ship officers and merchants, including one named Captain Edmund Saunders, who oversaw 20 slaving voyages. The houses at the end of the row, number 10 to 11, were owned by Saunders, and who had now become our primary focus. What initially drew us to house number 11 was the Black Lives Matter poster in the window, which was interesting to link back to our earlier work on Bristol, the Black Lives Matter movement, and the toppling of Colston's statue. In beginning to answer this question, we could look at articles on Saunders' life and his connections. How did he initially get involved? What led to him being involved, and what remains of his legacy today, if any? During our time in the city, it was interesting to note the juxtaposition between the new and the old. Despite our line of inquiry focusing on the city's past, it is only by looking at the city currently that we can fully understand our line of inquiry. The slave-produced wealth in architecture is in stark contrast to the parts of the city that remain poor, where remains of the slave trade are almost invisible. How have our perspectives of the city, such as that presented by Miles Chamber in his poem Bristol, Bristol, caused people to reflect on the city's history and those like Colston that were involved? The city, in one sense, holds such significant historical significance, but there is a call, particularly from the younger generations, for a rewriting of this history and how it comes to be remembered, which we can see came to physical premonition with the toppling of Colston's statue. So who was Captain Edmund Saunders? He started his career as a captain of ships involved in the network of trade between Britain, West Africa and the Caribbean. This led to his direct involvement in the Bristol transatlantic slave trade, where he was responsible for over 20 slaving voyages. His role as a developer reflects the immense wealth he gained from his role in the slave trade, and our aim is to explore the history of his involvement and answer questions of his importance as a slave trader in Bristol during the 18th century. After reviewing the material and topics we had covered in lectures, we found a group interest in the life of Bristol merchants who were involved in the transatlantic slave trade. We began asking questions such as which individuals were involved, who were the most prolific slave traders, and how could we find out this information several centuries later. Looking over Week 2 material led us to individuals such as John Piney and Edward Colston. Colston was a Bristol MP who made his fortune as a deputy governor of the Royal African Company, which between 1672 and 1698 transported around 100,000 enslaved Africans to plantations in the West Indies and America. Piney, as seen in Figure 4, was a plantation owner in the West Indies who owned plantations on the island of Nevis. Piney was a member of the West Indian Society and involved himself in lobbies against the abolition of the slave trade and trade emancipation. He had intricate links with the slave trade and owned several slaves himself. We began with some wider research about Bristol's connections to the slave trade. By the 18th century, Britain was one of the most important slave trading nations in the world. By the late 1730s, Bristol had become a premier slaving port. Although the slave trade was abolished in 1807, Bristol's wealth and rapid economic development throughout this time wouldn't have happened without it. The Week 2 material and research into Bristol gave us a brief insight into the lives of two individuals involved in the slave trade and the magnitude of it, but we wanted to know more. Who else was involved and how might we go about finding this information? As mentioned earlier, we decided to focus our research on Captain Edmund Saunders, but by looking over module material, we gained an idea of what kind of research sources we could use to find out more. Once we had narrowed down our line of inquiry to focus on Captain Edmund Saunders of Guinea Street, we began exploring documentaries, academic articles and online resources that mentioned and gave insight into Captain Edmund Saunders' role in the Bristol slave trade. With limited information available online about his direct links with the slave trade, it became apparent that we would have to widen our search into Saunders' home life and housing situation on Guinea Street to gain a better understanding of his wealth and hence success in the slave trade. Reading newspaper articles online informed us of Saunders' major role in property development on Guinea Street in the Redcliffe district of Bristol. Guinea Street is only minutes away from Bristol's port side, so when the slave trade grew in the early 18th century and merchants' wealth escalated rapidly, Saunders was among many who began developing in the area. Saunders was one of the key developers of Guinea Street, building many of the houses that still stand today, including number 10, one of the houses that initially led us to find Saunders. Further research into number 10 led us to a 2020 BBC documentary called A House Through Time, which followed the lives of those who had lived in number 10 since Saunders built it in 1718. Initially, we believed Saunders had lived in number 10, but the documentary informed us that although Saunders had built number 10 and many of the other houses on the road, he had actually resided in number 11. This led us to question about who lived in number 10 and if there was still a link to Saunders and his role in the slave trade. Although this now limited the amount we could learn through the documentary, with it instead turning to focus on a Captain Smith, another prolific trader in Bristol, we could follow up this new information about Saunders' role as a developer in Bristol by exploring official documents and archives about not only number 10 Guinea Street, but also the other properties that Saunders was connected to. The result of this would be understanding the role in which Saunders had in Bristol, especially on Guinea Street, and perhaps lead us towards new information sources such as National Archives. Despite the documentary not being focused on Captain Saunders as we had first hoped, it did inform us of the scale of Saunders' role in the slave trade. For example, we discovered that not only was he a slave trader, but one of Bristol's most prolific traders, trading 12,000 slaves over 20 voyages. To put this into context, it is believed Bristol's merchants shipped roughly 500,000 people into slavery, and Saunders was responsible for the enslavement of nearly 2.5% of these people. The documentary also gave us the names of several of the ships that Saunders captained, such as the Barclay. This information came from the National Archives, so by exploring these ships further and the archives, we may gain more information on Saunders and the extent of his role in the transatlantic trade.
After narrowing down our research to focus on Captain Edmund Saunders' role as a property developer on Guinea Street, we focused on further academic reading and other research methods which could be conducted in order to find out more about his role as a part of the slave trade. From the Antiquaries Journal, we found out that the houses in the area where his properties were developed displayed features such as panelling, which indicate the social status of the residents who, like Saunders, were involved in the slave trade, which indicates the extreme wealth generated from this. Further, we could get more information on his personal life by contacting the historian behind A House Through Time to get more information not seen in the episode, as the archives on Edmund Saunders were quite limited online. Within these archives, we could use them to see if there is more information on who is connected to Saunders, to collect more information possibly about why he came to be a property developer within Bristol, and information into his personal life. This could be explored further by trying to follow his family tree and find living relatives who we could interview and provide more information about whether his legacy is continued within the family line in terms of his wealth generated from the slave trade, and also more information on his family at the time, and whether they also played a role in Bristol's slave trade. Statistics to the exact number of slaves he was involved with at different times may also be drawn from this, which can give more of an insight into his status. During week 2 of the module, we explored the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography and National Archives to gain a greater insight into the life of slave trader John Pinney. Using more archives for Edmund Saunders would provide us with a greater insight into the role he played as a slave trader. Our field trip to Bristol employed visual methods to help us understand the ways in which history and heritage have been represented in the city. We placed our learning from the lectures into the physical environment in exploring our rabbit holes. The walking tour became the starting point for our inquiry, allowing us to gain a sense of Bristol as a place, and seeing how the legacies of the slave trade and those that were involved are still very much present in the city's landscape. Visiting museums such as the M Shed gave insight into how the city has chosen to remember and recite its involvement, be it through forms of art, media, or community collaboration. Despite having no exhibition on Saunders, in viewing the work on Colston, it aided our understanding of Merchant's role and how his legacy has changed over time in the city. In extending our line of inquiry further, we could interview current residents of Guinea Street, exploring questions such as how they came to live there, what they know of Saunders, the history of their houses, what it feels like to live on such a historically significant street. This would give us personal stories to back up our own findings of his life. We could also reach out to the filmmakers of A House Through Time to see how they collected their data, which would be useful in adding to our own understanding. Potential questions could be why they chose to film this episode and why on Saunders and Holbrook. Did they have the same questions that our rabbit holes brought us? And perhaps even asking them the kind of responses they received from the community and viewers, particularly from Bristolians themselves. This again returns to how we are trying to, despite discussing the city's past, still stay in touch with the cityscape today. In summary, in following our line of inquiry, we feel we've developed a greater understanding of Saunders' role in the Bristol slave trade and given thought to how this can be further developed through research. Our initial interest in Saunders began in Bristol when we followed the guided walking tour to Guinea Street. From here, we reviewed the Week 2 material where focus was given to the roles of individual merchants such as Colston and Pinney. Following on from this, in finding relevant articles online as well as the BBC documentary, we were able to gain insight into Saunders' role and have highlighted how our question can be explored further. We followed up from this with our collection of primary data in our visit to the M Shed and our walking tour. This could be taken further in interviewing the documentary producers, current residents of Guinea Street, and relatives/historians of Saunders. This research should ultimately help to answer the question of who was Captain Edmund Saunders and what was his role in the Bristol slave trade.